Voice Master.
The Black Cat, an Edgar Allan Poe story. I don't expect or solicit anyone to believe the seemingly crazy story which I am about to write. I'd be crazy to expect it. It's hard for me to believe it. But I'm not crazy, and I know I'm not dreaming. Tomorrow I die. So today I will tell my story. My intent is to clearly, briefly, and without comment tell the world about a series of simple household events. These events have terrified, tortured, and destroyed me, yet I will not attempt to explain them. To me they have presented little but horror. To many they will seem less terrible than devilish. Perhaps later someone may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace, someone more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than I, which will perceive, in the circumstances I detail with awe, nothing more than an ordinary series of very natural causes and effects. When I was a child, it was obvious I had a caring and calm nature. My tenderness of heart was even so noticeable as to make my companions joke about it. I was especially fond of animals, and had a great variety of pets. I spent most of my time with them, and was never happier than when I was feeding or playing with them. This fascination for animals grew as I got older, and in my adulthood I derived from it one of my main sources of pleasure. Anyone who has ever loved the faithful and smart dog already knows how satisfying it can be. There's just something about the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of an animal which goes directly to the heart of someone who has had a hard time finding a true friend in the hearts of man. I married early and was happy to find in my wife a disposition compatible with my own. Seeing my soft spot for domestic pets, she jumped at the chance to bring home some new friends. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. The cat was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and very smart. My wife, who was not the least bit superstitious, frequently joked about all black cats being witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious about it. I only mentioned it because it popped into my head as I was writing. The cat's name was Pluto. He was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he followed me wherever I went about the house. I even had problems keeping him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my life had altered my general nature and character for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I began to use abusive language towards my wife. I even threatened to hit her. My pets, of course, also suffered. I not only neglected, but abused them. For Pluto, however, I still restrained myself from hurting him, unlike the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog. When by accident or through affection they would come my way, I would scold them. But my disease grew worse, and in time even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat cross, began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home wasted from one of my regular bars, I didn't want to be bothered by the cat. I grabbed him, startling him slightly, and he bit me. I was instantly filled with a demonic rage powered by gin. I took a knife from my pocket, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. It pains my soul as I write these words, knowing that I could actually be so cruel. The next morning when I awoke, having fully recovered from my drunken state of mind, I experienced a range of emotions, half of horror, half of remorse, for the crime which I had committed, but it was at best a weak feeling. It wasn't enough to make me change my ways. Before long I found myself at the bottom of another bottle, drowning any thought of what I had done. The cat slowly recovered. He looked horrifying with his missing eye, but he was no longer in pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. At first, my heart ached at the thought of something that used to love me being absolutely terrified of me, but soon this feeling turned into irritation. Then came something completely terrifying, something perverse. I am no more sure that my soul lives than I am that perversiveness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or a silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Everyone has, at some point, despite our upbringing or best judgment, desired to break the rules. This spirit of perverseness was my ultimate undoing. I felt a strong urge to finish what I had started with that poor animal. One morning in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with tears streaming from my eyes and with remorse in my heart. Hung it because I knew it had loved me and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense. Hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the most infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. That night I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. My bedroom was in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife and myself made our escape from the inferno. The destruction was complete. Everything I owned was swallowed up, and I resigned myself from that point on to despair. I'm not trying to link what happened to the cat to what happened with my house. I am just offering all the details as to not leave even a possible link broken. The next day I visited the charred remains. All but one wall had fallen in. This wall, not very thick, stood about the middle of the house. My bed had previously rested against it. Astonishingly, due to being recently added, the plaster had not been burned by the fire. A dense crowd were collected around this wall, and many people seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with very minute and eager attention. The words strange, singular, and other similar expressions drew my attention. I approached and saw an imprinted image of a gigantic cat. The impression had such detail it was plainly obvious that there had been a rope around the animal's neck. When I first beheld this spirit, my wonder and my terror were extreme, but soon as I thought about it, I realized the cat had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd. Someone must have seen the cat hanging in a tree, cut it down, and thrown it through my bedroom window. This had most likely been done to wake me up. The falling of other walls had squashed the animal into the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had then created the image that was now embedded into the wall. Although I thus willingly accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the shocking fact just detailed, it didn't fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the vision of the cat, and during this period I felt something similar to remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to search myself among the vile places which I now routinely frequented for another cat with somewhat similar appearance, to replace Pluto. One night as I sat, buzzed, in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object resting upon the head of one of the massive hogsheads of gin or rum which make up the main furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, so the fact that I had not noticed the object on top sooner surprised me. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every aspect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large splotch of white covering nearly the whole region of his chest. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it, but this person had never seen it before. When I was ready to leave, the animal seemed intent on following me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated. I'm not sure why, but the fact that the cat liked me disgusted and annoyed me. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise abuse it, but gradually I came to look upon it with unspeakable loathing and to flee silently from its horrible presence as from a virus. What added to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning after I brought it home that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, made it more special to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed in a high degree that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my dislike to this cat, however, its fancy for me seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps like a shadow. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair, or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome touch. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down. At such times, although I longed to kill it, I just couldn't do it, partly because of a memory of my former crime, but mainly, I must confess, my absolute fear of the beast. This fear was not exactly a fear of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to admit that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the strangest coincidences as it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair, the only visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had killed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by remarkably slow degrees, nearly unnoticeable, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as imaginary. It had, at length, assumed an exact distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of that monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of the gallows. Oh, mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death! And now was I indeed miserable beyond the misery of mere humanity. Neither by day nor by night could I sleep. During the day the creature left me no moment alone, and, in the night, I awoke hourly from dreams of unspeakable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight, a nightmare made flesh, that I had no power to shake off, sitting eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole relations. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind. while, from the sudden, frequent, and uncontrollable outburst of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my forgiving wife was the most usual and most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me, upon some household errand, into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly tripped me. It infuriated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had up till now stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal which would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. My wife stopped it. Aggravated by the interference, I went into a demonic rage. I snatched my arm from her and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot, without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I immediately went to work hiding the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbours. Many projects entered my mind. At one point, I thought of cutting the corpse into tiny fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I thought about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box and getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better method than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was admirably adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of these walls was a bulge, caused by a false fire pit that had been walled up, and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position. With little trouble I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair, with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the greatest care. I looked around triumphantly, and said to myself, "Here at least, then, my labour has not been in vain." My next step was to look for that beast which had been the cause of so much misery, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at that moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate. But it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and refused to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the deep and blissful sense of relief which I felt in the absence of that detested creature. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I soundly and calmly slept. Yes, I slept, even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a free man. The monster, in terror, had fled the premises forever. I wouldn't see it again. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of police came very unexpectedly into the house, and proceeded again to search my home. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. Sure they would never find the body, I wasn't afraid. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not a muscle. My heart beat as calmly as an innocent man. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my chest and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. I was so happy I couldn't stop myself. I burned to say if but one word, by way of triumph, and to make sure they had no further suspicions of me. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the stairs, "I'm glad I've put your suspicions to rest. I wish you all health, and a little more courtesy. By the way, gentlemen, this is a very well constructed house. These walls are solidly put together." And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with the cane which I held in my hand, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the ghastly corpse of my wife. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the devil. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb. It was a cry, at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly abnormal and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror, half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that rejoice in the damnation. Of my own thoughts it is folly to speak. Nearly fainting, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell forcibly. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb.